Okay, hello everyone. I hope that you can hear me okay and that you can see me okay. My name's Theo, just been introduced. I'm connecting to you today from my home in London, where it's a little bit cold, but we're managing. And I'm going to be giving you a very brief, condensed snippet of one of the courses that I run with Central St. Martin's, which is called Interpreting Art, which we normally run in an intensive format over the course of a week, quite intensively, several hours a day. But these things are also referenced in my other online courses, which I'll mention at the end. But anyway, our topic today is in interpreting art, and that might sound a little bit intimidating because it is awfully general, right? And I think perhaps that's one of the things which intimidates people about this task, which is that there are so many options, so many approaches, and so many different kinds of art that we perhaps feel a little lost for direction. So today I've tried to curate a selection of practical approaches that I think will help you when it comes to approaching art which is difficult or challenging in some way, and generally helping you to feel more comfortable in your ability to interpret different works of art. Okay, so we're going to be looking at some general points about interpretation and issues with interpretation. We're going to be looking at some practical questions that you can adopt. We are going to be looking at some examples of artworks too, where we can put some of these to the test and see how they run. And then finally, there'll be some time at the end for your own questions. Okay, so let's get going. So I guess one of the things to acknowledge is that interpreting art has become quite a task. Okay, and it's something that we can already see the need for when we look to museums and arts institutions, for example, where you often have people who are hired to be in the museum. If anyone's been to the Tate Modern, for example, you have the sort of Tate volunteers who are around offering tours, and are around so that you can ask questions about the work which is on the walls. And it's no secret that since the 20th century, art has become more and more difficult to interpret. Okay, it's become more and more complex, more self-aware of its own status as art, more ironic, and more cryptic in many cases as well. So we find very often that art doesn't always present itself to us so clearly for interpretation. And one of those major shifts in the 20th century is that the audience begin to take on more of a responsibility for the meaning of artwork. So we're really kind of living in a time and in a relationship to art where we have a great deal of responsibility with the interpretation of art and making sure that we can find meaning or create meaning in many cases effectively and suitably. So we're going to be trying to tackle some of those big questions a little bit today. So I'm just going to be introducing some of these concepts around those things. So first of all, let's think, what are some of the common difficulties that we maybe encounter when interpreting art? And this is just a few, right? By no means all of the challenges that we might meet. Okay, so let's have a look at those. This is just, I meant to go to this a bit earlier. This is the example of the Tate Modern, when they very controversially took in Carl Andre's equivalent, which you can see down here, the bricks on the floor, and this poor woman who's trying to explain the work to this group of people, and which was met with a great deal of negative tabloid press. Perhaps one of those kind of milestone moments when museums had to really think about how interpretation is managed, in some cases, so that art can actually be justified for being on display. That's how deep this issue can get. Anyway, where were we? Some of the difficulties of interpreting art that I've selected. Okay, some common issues. It's too abstract. So we were talking about the 20th century, and one of those things that we find that begins in the first half of the 20th century is that art moves towards abstraction. So for those of you who are not familiar with abstraction, that simply means abandoning any representational or figurative aspects altogether, and that happens quite quickly at the start of the 20th century. By 1920, we've actually got quite a full-blown language of abstract painting, which is accepted in the avant-garde. So this makes it very difficult for us, and definitely for people who are new to art, because there's nothing there that we can actually latch onto, right? Especially looking at a painting like this by Joe Mitchell, just from the 1950s. All that means is that there's nothing in there which we can relate to the physical world, right? Nothing we recognize, no people, no sense of narrative, no objects. And we might be looking at it and trying to think, okay, what's actually going on there? What has she painted? But that ends up being something of a futile exercise when we try to force an abstract work to be figurative in some way. So that's one of the challenges that perhaps we meet. Okay, moving on, and connected to that last point, we might say, I can't relate to it. And I think that especially applies to abstract works, right? Because abstract works are less likely to include narrative or figuration or scenes. They're less likely, in some cases, to be emotionally stimulating. And I think that we often have a kind of expectation with art that it should relate to us on some emotional level. So lots of people feel like this is also a challenge as well, because art becomes something of a cryptic exercise, an exercise in decoding, rather than something that you enjoy. But I would like to argue that process of interpretation has to be something that we come to enjoy as part of the art experience. But especially with works like this, when we're looking at solar wit modular structure, where you wouldn't be in the wrong place for saying, where can I get this in IKEA? Okay, what section is it in? So we find it hard to relate to certain kinds of art, especially when they're abstract and in a certain abstract idiom. Moving on, some other difficulties, we might simply say that it's just plain weird. Okay, it's too weird, and we don't really understand what's going on. We don't know what the point is. Something I've heard many times in my classes, people looking at art and saying, what's the point? Why was this made? And one of the things we find is that, or we feel like art seems to want to confuse us by avoiding sense altogether. Okay, and that leaves us feeling a little bit perplexed, asking what the point of it is. So that can be quite difficult too. And what I would say to that is, we have to accept, okay, if we're going to improve our kind of our interpretation approaches, that art isn't always out to accommodate us. Okay, art can be quite confrontational. That can be directly, or it can be through the way that it avoids sense. We're looking at a work by Salvador Dali, so perhaps you already know that this belongs to the movement of surrealism, a movement which deliberately avoids straightforward logical sense. So that's a challenge in itself, right? So we have to develop a tolerance for ambiguity when it comes to interpreting art and wanting to be able to interpret a wider range of art. Okay, so the weirdness, absolutely something we will come across in our many encounters with art, but something we have to put up with. And I would say also, not something that we have to think of as a puzzle to be solved. And we'll have more on that in a bit. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to some core questions. Okay, so what I've done, just having a bit of tea. So I normally, with my my foundation and undergraduate classes, I go through these questions as part of a larger set. And this is just a selection of them, and they're practical questions which I've isolated, which I think that will be helpful in a number of situations if you're confronted with an artwork that you find challenging or you're having difficulty interpreting. Okay, so these are questions which are designed to give you a bit of a prompt. Okay, they're designed to help you interpret or get on the way to interpreting something in most cases. So here they are, and I'll talk you through them. So beginning at the top here, this is, I guess, for me, the most important one. And the one which I always offer to students first, which, how is this art similar or different to others I have seen? Right, very straightforward, very simple. And I think a lot of the things we're going to be looking at today are actually quite simple in their first instance. So what this means is that you need to be building mental reference points to other works of art that you know, so that you can begin things with a comparison, right? If there's nothing that you recognize in the work, if the work feels completely new, you can bring it in to your own context, right? Your own experience with art by asking, okay, how does this fit in with what I've seen before? Does it align with anything that I recognize in the work of other artists, in other art practices? And if not, what specifically is different? So that might not get you all the way to a solid interpretation, but it certainly gets you on the way by means of comparison and putting an artwork into a network of other artworks. So comparison is a really useful tool here. Okay, let's move on through these, and lots of these are kind of art historical questions, but they can be expanded beyond that. So does this artwork try to make a comment on a certain subject, or a comment on something more broadly, I guess you could say? So we try to determine what is the angle of this work. Okay, what comment is it making on what it is painting? And of course, that question might not be relevant for certain abstract works, for example, and we may augment that comment to be something else, right? Does this artwork have a certain angle? Does it have a certain mood to it, perhaps, if we're going to speak even more broadly, and that might accommodate abstract works too. But this is tied to the next one, which is, what about the way the artwork is made creates that comment or that mood or that angle? Okay, so why I've tied those two questions together is because it allows you to begin to make interpretations by analyzing certain formal aspects of the artwork. What I mean by formal aspects is literally what's in the work. So if we're looking at a painting, we might think, okay, this painting is, it's got a critical or maybe a kind of condemning, maybe even an outraged tone to it, or a comment which is outraged. So what is it about the work itself which gives me that sense of anger or frustration, perhaps? We look at the colors that have been used, we look at the composition, we look at the way in which the paint has actually been applied to the canvas, and we see if we can find some formal quality which helps us to justify or to give evidence to this supposed comment or angle or mood that we see. Okay, so we need evidence, and we're looking for that evidence to back up what we're seeing in it, and we can do that through aligning formal qualities with those points. Okay, I hope that's clear. So here's some more questions, and these are maybe perhaps more straightforwardly art historical. What can this artwork tell me about the society of its age? Okay, so very important, and I think this question helps because it can be applied to pretty much every single artwork that you will encounter, right? And I guess this approach is the contextual approach. It doesn't ask you so much to think about the artwork as it is, but it asks you to connect that to external factors. So perhaps we're looking at an abstract work, and it's a really radically abstract one, and we're thinking, okay, maybe you're having trouble understanding the work itself, but you think, okay, so what kind of society would have produced this very radically abstract work, or this very difficult work? What historical conditions and societal conditions were there which helped to produce this work? Okay, and that helps us to connect to history and to give it some context, and those things, they feed off each other. Okay, the work and the context, they help to inform each other and to give you a fuller image of what's going on. Do ideas about art at this time explain the way this painting looks? So this is, again, requires you to think about accepted ideas of art. And I say accepted because if we can establish what a certain tradition is, perhaps, or a certain accepted practice, we can then go to this next question, which is, does it attempt to break with those established ideas of its time? Okay, so maybe if we think, if we go way back to like the 17th, the 18th century, when we think about, very traditional classical painting, academic painting, and we think, okay, maybe we don't know much about it, but we know that certainly there was a certain tradition going on, and we might think, does this painting look like it is the product of dominant ideas about art at the time, or does it look like it is going against those ideas? And just that looking at those things can give you some direction with regards to interpreting a work of art. Okay, so those are just 6 questions. There are, of course, many more questions we can ask. Those are just a selection of ones that I think are good to keep handy when you're approaching art, especially new art. So I've got some cases now that I'm going to talk through. So let's take some examples that I've chosen, and we can think about how we might approach interpreting these. And I'm going to try and do these. Obviously, I've spoken about these examples many times. That's the kind of the disclaimer, but we'll try and approach them from a way as if we're totally naive to them. Okay, so that's kind of a very beneficial way of doing things. So let's start with a historical work. A very old work. Okay, so I'm trying to include a broad range of things here. So looking at this work, perhaps the first thing we think is, what does the painting give me in terms of things to take and use to interpret? Some paintings offer themselves up more readily than others. This one certainly offers itself up quite keenly. So there's a lot to look at here, right? And perhaps we're already drawn to this wide array of objects on the table. We also have certain people, and we can already latch on to what those objects are and the relationships between those objects, and perhaps the relationships that those objects have to the people in the painting, and maybe the people in the painting, if we're going to make it more complicated. So clearly this is a painting. I mean, take into account some of the things that you see here. Just getting my cool out, right? There's several things which we can use to interpret here. And I'm not trying to tell you that there's kind of one way we can take it, but this gives you lots of ways to interpret. Let's have a look. We have the presence of coins, perhaps an allusion to money, perhaps they're historical coins. And again, we have what looks like to be a collection of certain papers. They look at stamps or medals, and then above that we have a globe. We're thinking that, who would these kinds of possessions belong to at this time? We can imagine that it's probably someone of a fair amount of wealth. Maybe it's someone even who's traveled. And we think about, we can make an assumption about whether travel was common at this time, what travel was used for. And if we were to go further, we may think about perhaps colonial exploits at this time. Perhaps there's a sort of colonial undertone to that kind of theme of exploration and adventure and wealth that is implied by the things in the globe. Furthermore, I mean, if I was going to single out two important things, I would actually look at the art within this painting. So clearly this is a painting which is about, more than just than one thing. And we could argue that this is an artwork about art itself. Have a look here. We can see here a sculpture on the table, and looking closely, we might say this reminds us, or we can recognize that it looks like a Greek sculpture or something which is Roman. Perhaps this is an assumption I think quite quickly make. And furthermore, we actually have the act of painting going on in the image, as well as another genre here. We have the kind of classical nude or mythological nude at the bottom here, as well as some landscapes. So we're thinking, why is it that this painting includes so many examples of art? Okay, and why is it collecting them? Why is it bringing them together? And if this is a Greek or Roman sculpture, why is it included with these other examples of art? Perhaps it tells us about somebody who is collecting these kinds of art, and then maybe we would say, why is it that this person collects this kind of art? So clearly this is something which is representative of a certain strain of culture, right? And maybe we can even look to the back to see a couple of characters in here who we imagine are the owners of these objects, or people who are amassing such objects. And you can even see actually another image in another globe at the back on the table there. So I'm not going to be going all the way with this because we've got a lot to go through. This is a work that clearly states a certain theme, many themes, and if we're going to read it historically, we can certainly use it to make assumptions about the culture and the society of the time. Okay, it really seems to be pointing to those things, whether it's about capitalism, or whether it's actually just about the culture of art and humanities at the time. Let's move on. I'm going to be moving quite quickly. So obviously, painting gets a lot more complicated, and I've chosen some kind of quite typical examples for the purposes here. So we're looking at Picasso. Maybe some people noticed that this is a cubist painting, right? If you're familiar with cubism, perhaps you'll notice it. If not, that's okay. But when we look at this, okay, how are we supposed to approach a work like this? it really seems like there's much less for us to hold on to. Okay, we can't identify things in the same way that we see in the last painting that give us quite clear clues and leads to interpretation. That's really not the case here. We can just about make out some text at the bottom. Maybe if you look very close, you can see the outline of a bottle over here, and to the left, you can perhaps see part of an instrument, some more letters, but none of these things are complete, right? What I would say, I would suggest, is that if we're going around this painting looking for clues and trying to follow those clues as to what the painting is about, perhaps we're looking at the painting in the wrong way, because this painting, it leaves us a lot of work to do with working out what the theme is. And we can begin by thinking, why the painting is doing that. The difficulty is kind of part of the work, and it's not like when we find the contents of the work that we understand it. If we did identify these, we've got a guitar, we can assume what looks like a newspaper or a letter, a bottle of wine. Those things do not really tell us much about the artwork itself. They don't explain why it's been made this way. So we can assume that the way the work has been made is something which is perhaps more important to look at than the subject itself. Okay, so think about it that way, that the fact that this painting is so different and that it rejects that kind of straightforward figuration is already very, very important, and that can actually be something of a point of interpretation itself, right? That if you're going to say, what's this work about, what's it doing, we could say that this is a work which is an experiment in the way that we read objects in a painting. It's an experiment in how those objects can be represented, and it tells us that those objects can be represented in a way which doesn't necessarily have to be as they appear realistically, right? And we can take that further. We can think about, okay, why would it be this way? Maybe we don't have a reason kind of why, but we can see what's happening. The artist has clearly got these objects in his sights, and what he's done is he's taken control over those objects, right? We're thinking about how has the artist interpreted them, and what does that tell us about the artist's approach? Perhaps this is an artist who is trying to show us a new way of perceiving these objects. And if it is a new way, it certainly seems like quite a radical one, and we could perhaps read that as a kind of statement in itself, as a breaking from that traditional figuration. Okay, so I'm going to move on from this one because we are eating through time very quickly. I think we'll have time for one more after this. Let's take it even further. We've looked at, cubism is difficult enough, and now maybe we're looking at this and we're thinking, okay, how on earth, where do you start with an artist like Jackson Pollock when you're looking at the painting and it's just absolutely impossible to find a starting place, much more extreme, and clearly goes beyond the kind of difficulty that we see in Picasso. So what I would say is, with a work like this, is when you feel very, very lost, there will always be something that does present itself to you, and sometimes that can be quite obvious. And I think Jackson Pollock is a good example. Okay, there's no objects, there's no composition at all compared to the Cubist work, and that's already something worth taking note of, perhaps as a progression in abstract painting, something which already intends to be different and more radical than other works of painting. That's already an important point. But what's there for us to begin to make interpretations with beyond that? Have a look at just actually what's in the painting. You're saying, okay, there's nothing there. Well, there is. There's a lot of paint. There's a lot of paint. There's many different layers, and actually you can see the paint itself very clearly, right? And that's not something that you can reach that conclusion just through observation and looking at the painting very clearly. Whereas even with the Picasso, the paint itself is put into forms, it's put into colors, it's put into certain structures. Jackson Pollock seems to be working with the raw materials themselves. And perhaps if we can't see anything in the painting, it's very confusing. This is an important thing to look at. Maybe we would take that further. How has the paint been applied to the work? Has it been painted on with a brush? Have a look and you'll quite quickly see that this is quite a different style of painting, right? So this is where we maybe use the formal elements first for interpretation. How is this painting being made? What kinds of materials and how have those materials been engaged? And that question will be more fruitful for some examples than it will be for others. I would say with here, maybe we would look at this and perhaps look to the gestures on the canvas itself, the movement of it. And we think when we look at this, we can actually see Jackson Pollock moving around the canvas. And maybe if we were going to take that further, we say, okay, we can see a lot of gesture. We read that gesture as a kind of record of Jackson Pollock's process of painting. Then we can think, perhaps if this is such a kind of true record of his movements and his process, perhaps it acts as a window into his emotional, his inner life and his emotional state whilst painting the work. That way we can maybe even take it into a kind of biographical interpretation. Okay, one more example, then I'm gonna stop and do questions, and let's just take it all the way up to a kind of contemporary example. So maybe this is disarming for kind of the opposite reason. The Pollock and the Picasso, they were both works which didn't seem to offer us up much to interpret. They were very abstract and they were very unfamiliar in their style. But here, this is almost too familiar. Okay, too familiar. It's a shopping trolley. We're thinking, I've seen a shopping trolley before, and how am I supposed to think of this shopping trolley as a work of art? Why am I seeing it as a work of art? So I think the first thing to take note of, again, it's very obvious and it's very clear, and some of those things they can be the first thing that you see. And we're thinking, okay, I am looking at a shopping trolley that's been gold plated and put into a gallery, and that's something which is worth examining in itself, right? The fact that we have this everyday object which we're now looking at as an artwork, that move from the everyday into the gallery or into the space of art is already very significant, and it tells us maybe, as one option, about the intentions of the artist. Maybe this artist is trying to show us how everyday objects could be presented as artworks, and that's supposed to be a radical gesture, perhaps. Okay. We've got some other options here. For example, we were asking questions about the society that might have produced this work, right? And actually, if we go back to that first painting we looked, the Franz Franken still life, that was a painting which showed the culture it was from. And I think whilst this is maybe a little bit stranger, maybe even more mundane, it's still something which tells us about the society that it comes from, right? It's from 2000. We know that we live in a society of mass consumption, right? A kind of consumer democracy, global capital, these kinds of things. It's clear that the artist is latching on to this element of her contemporary world and bringing that into her art. So that actually the subject is fairly straightforward in this work. And I guess the questions to that, we think, okay, it's a work about consumer culture. It's a work about consumption itself. So then maybe the next question to ask in order to deepen an interpretation like this is, okay, so what comment, what angle? And that was one of my key questions, right? We've determined the subject. We think, is this a work perhaps that celebrates consumer culture, or is it a work that is criticizing consumer culture? We want to work out what the artist angle is. Okay, so that's quite a nice way to build it up from looking at the object itself, thinking about where that object comes from, why that object is presented as art, and what the artist intends by presenting that object. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I think this has been quite a blitz of ideas. If I did any more, I think we'd be at risk of kind of overloading. Okay, so we can open it up for some questions for 15 minutes. Okay.
What, in your opinion, is the purpose about art, or should we focus on the irrational emotions it transmits to us?
Sorry, you were breaking up there. Can you say that again?
Somebody asks, what, in your opinion, is about art, or should we focus on the irrational emotions it transmits to us?
Okay. Well, okay. The purpose of art, that's a really general question. And I mean, when you ask that question about, what is the meaning of art? What is art? You're asking very broad metaphysical questions that belong to art theory and aesthetics. I think to answer that question is something which is actually kind of impossible, right? I think when we're thinking about art, we're dealing with a plurality of purposes. So there are many different purposes which art takes, and there are many different contexts in which art takes place. So for example, all of the works that I've spoken about today, they are pretty much all Western European or American works, so quite canonical traditional works. The purposes of those works we can maybe talk about quite generally, but artworks from different cultures, from different cultural contexts, different parts of the world, are going to have a very different explanation. So that's not something we can answer kind of on the head without getting into some quite deep and overarching philosophical concepts. Should it be about intellectual or the irrational emotions? Well, look, this is you've posited two things there. The interpretation that you make and the directions that interpretation takes is down to you. Okay, as I've said, and what I stress in my class is that you are responsible for the meaning that the artwork takes, and that doesn't mean you can do whatever you want with the artwork, but it means that you have to think about what is the most responsible and convincing interpretation that you can forge, and you can drive that with a certain level of flexibility in different directions. Okay.
Thank you. And Eleanor asks, should every artwork have a concept, for example, in fashion?
Should every artwork have a concept? I'm not really sure what you mean. I mean, should every artwork have a concept? I mean, what would be the opposite of an artwork without a concept, without an idea, right? I mean, surely all art has some kind of idea behind it, whether that idea is extremely simple, such as straightforward self-expression, or whether it's something more complex, which engages with society or politics or whatever. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by as in like in fashion. I mean, if I was going to try and interpret that question, I would say that sure, I mean, we should try to give every artwork some kind of explanation or idea if we're going to think about it within this, especially within this educational or academic framework. So if I understand your question correctly, I would say yes, I think. Okay.
Moving on, Zara asks, is it okay for different people to have startling differences in their interpretation of a piece?
Great question. Yeah, absolutely. It is okay. I mean, one of the things that we do in my course, which always is really fun, is that everyone has different angles, right? And there becomes this kind of community aspect to interpretation, in which several people with different opinions have to discuss their opinions, right? They have to be able to convince others of their interpretations. Through that process of debate and discussion and putting different interpretations to the test, where we work out which interpretation is going to be the most fitting for a certain artwork. So absolutely, it's okay for people to have different interpretations, and they always will. But when we think critically, we have to put those interpretations against each other and think about which is going to match this artwork the best. So yeah, good question.
Next, we have Philip asking, if an artist is deliberately obscure, is the artist losing control of their art?
I mean, I would say that artists can be willfully obscure, right? And I think many artists in the 20th century, especially if we look at straightforward conceptual art, part of that is making sure that your art is open to interpretation. And many conceptual artists were aware of the fact that their artworks would be interpreted from many angles. So I don't think that it necessarily means that they lose control. I think that obscurity can be part of the intention. So I would say no, not necessarily.
Okay, and Yolanda asks, is there a narrative behind abstract impressionist work such as Pollock's?
Is there a narrative? Well, I mean, we could certainly read a narrative into it, but that narrative would be rather strange, right? So, I mean, I mean, that question is for you to answer, right? Can you read a narrative into this work? And if you can read a narrative into it, how would you justify and explain the narrative? If it's a narrative, it's going to be a narrative which is certainly different to what we traditionally expect, which involves, figuration, the sense of a progression of time, for example. So I would say it's possible. It's a popular angle that is taken when interpreting works of Jackson Pollock. However, for example, abstract expressionism, it's a huge, huge style, right? And actually style is the wrong word for it because there's so many different artists. Look at Cy Twombly. I'll type that out in case you're interested in his works. He was an abstract expressionist. And he was very interested in Greek mythology, for example, and he used Greek mythology in his abstract works, but they're very difficult works. So we think about, how is it possible to get those Greek mythological narratives into an abstract expressionist work? So it's a good question, but one which is ultimately kind of down to you to find evidence for.
Yeah. Yolanda asks, is there a danger of over-interpreting a work of art and losing its authentic meaning?
Yeah, absolutely there is. And this is something that we have to take responsibility for when we're interpreting a work, which is precisely what you said, over-interpretation, and trying to think honestly about whether we are over-interpreting a work. And I would think that Jackson Pollock, this work, for example, is a good case because it is quite easy to over-interpret a work like this. And I think what we mean by over-interpretation is stretching an interpretation too far, to the point where we're finding perhaps less and less evidence within the work itself to explain our interpretation. Okay, so there absolutely is a danger, and I think that what we see in 20th century art is that it becomes quite easy to do that. So there are certain ways that we can make sure we do that by following certain principles of interpretation, which I don't have time to go through today, but something that we talk about in more detail.
Probably have time for one or two more questions. So Odine asks, do we always have to look at what the artist wants to say through his work of art? Or is it okay to interpret our own unique way? Is interpretation subjective? I think you've already covered that, actually.
I mean, what you're talking about is the issue of artist intention, right? Which is that when we look, for example, at Picasso's painting and we say, okay, is the correct way to interpret it what Picasso wanted? Okay, and there are lots of people who think that. Actually, it's very common to think that what the artist intends is the final meaning, but I don't think that that's true, right? When an artist makes an artwork and they put it up to display to the world, they have to acknowledge that that work is going to be interpreted in multiple different ways. And what we find, I mean, for example, with Jackson Pollock, we're talking a lot about this painting, but it's a good case, is that it entertains so many different interpretations, and that many of the interpretations that have been ascribed to an artwork by critics or other artists or by audiences very, very often overtake what the artist intended. Go to any museum, and if you try to read those caption cards, it's quite rare that you will find that they attest always to the artist's intention, and instead they go for what we might call a dominant or a consensus interpretation, which has been agreed by a wider community of critics and audiences across time. So yeah, I mean, you absolutely can interpret subjectively as long as you're doing that as authentically as you can, and you do consider the artist's intention as one element of your interpretation, but not the principal and be-all, end-all element. Okay.
Let me see. Does the title of work give some idea about the work itself?
Does the title give an idea? Definitely. I mean, it depends on the artwork. I mean, Jackson Pollock, number 5. Okay, what does that tell us about Jackson Pollock's painting? Very, very, very little. Okay, Picasso's, the title here, Letterario, that tells us the name of the little journal down here. Very, very little. So it depends. I would say with contemporary works, especially with conceptual works, which have very little formal content, then the title can be a nice way to navigate the work.
And probably the final question, actually, what do you think makes seemingly unrelatable modern pieces such as abstract impressionism so popular within modern culture?
Why are they so popular? So why are these difficult artworks so popular? Why does everyone talk about them? Well, I mean, one of the reasons is that they are so accommodating of different interpretations, right? And actually, whether we like works like this or not, they are very interesting and very stimulating to talk about. Okay, and they give you a lot of opportunity to practice certain skills of interpretation, and they generally make a good conversation. I mean, the question of someone comes in front of a Jackson Pollock and they say, my 5-year-old could have done that, and I've actually heard that like 1,000 times. That itself is like a very big talking point, right? And it's because that contemporary art and later modern art of the 50s opens itself up to multiple interpretations and problematizes itself so readily that we can talk about it in a more open way, and a way which can accommodate more and more angles. So of course it attracts many more perspectives, and that makes it a nice point of discussion in the art world. So that's part of the reason, I would say.
Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you very much. And if anyone's interested, I'm running some online courses which you can find on the Central St. Martin's page regarding art history and art theory. So maybe I'll see you in one of my courses.